January 14, 1945. Okinawa Prefecture, southern Japan. ***. The wind carried salt and ash across the blackened cliffs. In a makeshift American detention camp near the edge of the Pacific, a young Japanese soldier named Corporal Hideaki Tanaka sat with his back against a canvas tent, his uniform still stiff with dried seawater and blood. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from the collapse of everything he had been taught to believe. 3 days earlier, he had been prepared to die. Now he was alive, a prisoner, and in his grip was a tall glass filled with something thick, pale, and impossibly cold. He stared at it as if it were a weapon. Around him, 24 other Japanese prisoners, gaunt, hollow-eyed, some still wearing bandages stained brown, watched in silence. The American guard who had handed out the drinks stood at a distance, smoking a cigarette, indifferent. To him, this was routine. To the prisoners, it was incomprehensible. The glass sweated in the tropical heat. A thin straw jutted from its mouth. Tanaka had never seen anything like it. He brought it cautiously to his lips, and the first taste of vanilla milkshake touched his tongue like a cold, sweet shock-wave. He laughed. It was not a laugh of joy, but of disbelief, a sound that escaped him before he could suppress it. The others turned. Some frowned. One man, older, with a scar across his jaw, muttered a word in Japanese that meant disgrace. But Tanaka kept drinking, and after a moment another soldier reached for his own glass. Then another. Within minutes the laughter spread, not loud, not triumphant, but bewildered, almost childlike. They drank, and in drinking, they tasted something more than sugar and cream. They tasted the end of the war they thought they understood. To comprehend why this moment mattered, one must first understand the ideology that had carried these men into battle. The Japanese soldier of the Pacific War was not merely a combatant. He was a vessel of Bushido, the way of the warrior, a philosophy that taught him to value honor above life, death above surrender, and the emperor above self. From childhood, he was conditioned to believe that the West, and America in particular, was a decadent, spiritually bankrupt civilization, bloated with material excess but hollow in spirit. American soldiers were portrayed as weak, cowardly, dependent on machines and luxuries because they lacked the inner discipline and purity that defined the Japanese soul. This was not propaganda alone. It was woven into the fabric of military training, into the songs sung in barracks, into the letters sent home from the front. Japanese soldiers were told that America's wealth was a curse, not a blessing, that it had made Americans soft, unable to endure hardship, incapable of the kind of suffering that forged true warriors. To surrender to such an enemy was not merely defeat, it was spiritual annihilation. Better to die by one's own hand, by grenade or blade, than to fall into the hands of a people so morally inferior. And yet here they were. The milkshake was not an accident. It was policy. In the latter years of the Pacific War, American military strategists had begun to understand that the Japanese soldiers' willingness to fight to the death was not merely a matter of fanaticism, but of belief, a belief that could be shaken, if confronted with the right kind of evidence. Psychological operations teams, working alongside intelligence officers, developed a strategy of calculated kindness. Prisoners of war were not to be merely fed and housed. They were to be overwhelmed with the material abundance of American life, confronted with a reality so starkly different from what they had been taught that it would crack the ideological foundation beneath their feet. The milkshake was a weapon. It was chosen deliberately. Cold, sweet, rich, impossible to produce in a nation where sugar was rationed, where milk was scarce, where even the most basic foodstuffs had become luxuries reserved for the elite. The Imperial Japanese Army fed its soldiers on rice and pickled vegetables, on meager rations that grew smaller as the war dragged on and supply lines collapsed. By 1945, frontline troops were often starving, scrounging for roots and insects, their bodies wasting away even as they fought. And here, in an enemy prison camp, they were handed a drink that seemed to belong to another world entirely. A world of surplus, of waste, of impossible plenty. Hideaki Tanaka had not eaten a full meal in 6 weeks. His unit had been cut off on a small island, bombed relentlessly, their supplies destroyed. They had boiled seaweed and chewed on leather straps. When the Americans finally overran their position, Tanaka had expected execution. Instead, he was given water, then soup, then bread. And now this, a glass of something cold and sweet that tasted like nothing he had ever known. He finished it. He wanted another. The laughter that spread through the camp that day was not universal. Some prisoners refused to drink. They sat rigid, eyes fixed on the ground, their faces masks of shame and fury. To accept the milkshake was to acknowledge the possibility that they had been lied to, that the enemy they had been taught to despise was not weak, not decadent, but powerful in ways they could not reconcile with their training. One young private, no more than 19, threw his glass into the dirt and spat. He was restrained by an American MP, gently, and led away. He did not resist. He wept, but most drank. And in drinking, they began a process of cognitive dissonance that would define the rest of their lives. The milkshake was the first crack in the wall, but it was not the last. In the days and weeks that followed, the prisoners were given more: hot meals, clean clothes, medical care, cigarettes, even newspapers. They were allowed to write letters home, though few did. They were shown films, American films, full of laughter and music and images of cities untouched by war. They watched in silence, and some cried. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher named Kenji Yamamoto, later wrote in his diary, "I do not know what to believe anymore. They treat us better than our own officers did. They waste food. They smile. They do not hate us. How can this be the enemy we were told would rape and murder us? How can this be the nation we were told was dying?" The American interrogators noticed the change. Reports from POW camps across the Pacific documented a pattern. After weeks of humane treatment and exposure to American abundance, Japanese prisoners began to cooperate. Not all, but many. They provided intelligence, maps, information about troop movements and fortifications. Some even agreed to record propaganda messages, urging their comrades to surrender, to stop dying for a cause that had already been lost. These men were called turncoats by their fellow prisoners, but they did not see themselves that way. They saw themselves as men who had woken from a dream. The history of the milkshake itself is a quiet emblem of American industrial and cultural evolution. Born in the late 19th century as a whiskey-laced health tonic, it was transformed in the early 20th century into a soda fountain staple, a thick, sweet drink made possible by electric blenders and the rise of commercial ice cream production. By the 1920s, it was a symbol of American youth culture, served in diners and drugstores, a treat for teenagers and families. During the Great Depression, it persisted as an affordable luxury. And during World War II, it became a link to home for American soldiers, a taste of normalcy in the midst of chaos. But for the Japanese prisoner, the milkshake had no such history. It was alien, inexplicable, a product of a civilization that seemed to operate by different rules entirely. The very existence of such a thing, a drink that served no nutritional purpose beyond pleasure, that was cold when warmth was precious, that was given freely to enemies, defied everything they had been taught about scarcity, discipline, and the proper relationship between man and material. In the spring of 1945, an American officer named Captain Robert Jensen conducted a series of informal interviews with Japanese POWs at a camp in Guam. His notes, preserved in the National Archives, offer a glimpse into the prisoner's state of mind. One man, a sergeant who had fought on Iwo Jima, told him, "We were told you had nothing. that your factories were bombed, your people starving, that you were desperate. But you give us more food in one day than we saw in a month. You have so much you can waste it on us. We cannot understand this." Another prisoner, younger, said simply, "The milkshake was the first time I realized we had lost." Jensen wrote in his report, "The psychological impact of abundance cannot be overstated. These men have lived under conditions of extreme deprivation, told that it was noble, that it made them strong. To confront the opposite, an enemy who can afford to be generous, who wastes nothing because there is always more, is to confront the possibility that everything they believed was a lie." But not all prisoners experienced the milkshake as a revelation. For some, it was a source of deeper shame, a confirmation that they had failed not only as soldiers but as men. The code of Bushido demanded death before dishonor, and to live as a prisoner, worse, to accept kindness from the enemy, was to violate that code in the most fundamental way. Some prisoners withdrew into silence, refusing to speak, refusing to eat. A few attempted suicide, though they were stopped. Others clung to the belief that the war was not truly over, that the emperor would never surrender, that rescue or victory was still possible. One such man was Lieutenant Masao Fujita, a veteran of the Guadalcanal campaign. He refused the milkshake. He refused all American food, surviving on the bare minimum required to keep him alive. When questioned, he said only, "I am already dead." He was not alone. In several camps, groups of prisoners formed secret pacts, vowing to resist American re-education, to maintain their loyalty to the emperor no matter what. They whispered at night, planning escapes that never came, writing letters they could not send. But even among these men, the milkshake haunted them. It was impossible to ignore. The smell of vanilla, sweet and artificial, drifted through the camps like a ghost. They heard the laughter of those who drank, saw the changes in their faces, less gaunt, less hollow, less afraid. And slowly, over weeks and months, even the most resistant began to soften. Not all, but enough. By the summer of 1945, when the atomic bombs fell and the emperor's voice crackled over the radio announcing surrender, the camps fell silent. Some prisoners wept. Others sat motionless, unable to process what they had heard. But many felt something else, a strange, guilty relief. The war was over. They had survived. And the world they returned to would not be the world they had left. The milkshake, then, was more than a drink. It was a metaphor, a symbolic object that came to represent everything these men had been taught to despise and everything they were beginning, against their will, to understand. It was cold in a world of heat, sweet in a world of bitterness, abundant in a world of scarcity. It was pleasure without purpose, luxury without guilt. It was American. And in its sweetness there was a lesson. The lesson was not about military strength, though strength was part of it. It was not about industrial capacity, though capacity was part of it. The lesson was about choice, the idea that a society could produce enough not merely to survive, but to enjoy, to waste, to give away. The Japanese soldier had been raised in a culture where sacrifice was the highest virtue, where the individual existed only to serve the collective, where comfort was suspect and indulgence was weakness. The milkshake challenged all of that. It said, "You can have more. You can want more. You do not have to suffer to be worthy." This was the ideological earthquake that the milkshake represented. It was not a denial of discipline or duty, but an expansion of what was possible, a vision of life where both could coexist, where a man could be strong and still enjoy a moment of sweetness, where a nation could be powerful and still generous. For men who had been taught that strength required suffering, this was a difficult truth to accept. But the milkshake did not ask for acceptance. It simply was. In the years after the war, many former prisoners returned to Japan and tried to rebuild their lives. Some succeeded. Others did not. The shame of surrender lingered, a shadow that followed them through families and workplaces, whispered about but rarely spoken aloud. But among those who had been in the camps, there was a secret knowledge, a shared memory that set them apart. They had tasted something that their countrymen had not. They had seen the other side. Hideaki Tanaka, the young corporal who had laughed at his first sip of vanilla milkshake, returned to his village in 1946. He did not speak of the war. He became a farmer, married, raised children. But in 1963, when his daughter asked him what he remembered most about the war, he did not mention battles or comrades or the emperor's voice on the radio. He said, "I remember the milkshake. I remember thinking it was impossible. And then I remember realizing that the impossible was real." The symbolism of the milkshake extended beyond the individual. In the broader context of the Pacific War, it became part of a larger American strategy of re-education and reconstruction. The same principles that guided the treatment of prisoners, humane care, material abundance, exposure to democratic ideals, would later shape the occupation of Japan. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, understood that military victory was not enough. To truly defeat Japan, America had to defeat the ideology that had driven it to war. And so the milkshake, in a sense, became a blueprint. The occupation brought food, medicine, infrastructure, education. It brought jazz and baseball and Hollywood films. It brought the idea that life could be more than duty and sacrifice, that happiness was not a betrayal of honor but a human right. Not all Japanese accepted this. Many resented it, saw it as cultural imperialism, a new kind of conquest. But others, especially the young, embraced it. They built a new Japan, one that would become one of the wealthiest and most democratic nations on earth. The milkshake, then, was a beginning. It was the first sip of a new world, strange and sweet and impossible to undrink. There is a photograph, rarely seen, taken in the summer of 1945 at a POW camp in the Philippines. It shows a group of Japanese prisoners sitting in the shade of a palm tree, holding glasses. Some are smiling. One man in the foreground is laughing, his head thrown back, his mouth open wide. The caption, written in faded pencil on the back, reads, "First taste of ice cream." They couldn't believe it. The photograph is not famous. It has never been published in a major history book. But it survives, tucked away in an archive, a small piece of a larger story. It is a reminder that war is not only fought with guns and bombs, but with ideas, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a bullet, but a milkshake. The men in that photograph are gone now. Most of them died decades ago, their stories lost or forgotten. But the moment they lived, the moment when laughter broke through shame, when disbelief gave way to wonder, when the taste of vanilla milkshake shattered the certainty of ideology, that moment remains. It echoes through history, a quiet testament to the strange and unpredictable ways that wars are won and lost, not only on battlefields but in the human heart. In the end, the milkshake was a gift and a curse. It was a gift because it offered sustenance, pleasure, a glimpse of a world beyond suffering. But it was a curse because it demanded a reckoning, a confrontation with the possibility that everything one had believed, everything one had fought for, might have been built on a lie. For some prisoners, that reckoning was liberating. For others, it was unbearable. But none could ignore it. Years later, historians would debate the ethics of using material abundance as a tool of psychological warfare. Some argued that it was manipulation, a form of coercion that exploited the vulnerability of starving, traumatized men. Others countered that it was simply the truth, that showing prisoners the reality of American life was not propaganda but honesty, and that if that honesty undermined their faith in Japanese militarism, so much the better. The prisoners themselves had mixed feelings. In interviews conducted decades after the war, some remembered the milkshakes with gratitude, as the moment they realized they might survive, that the enemy was not the monster they had been told to fear. Others remembered them with bitterness, as the moment they realized they had been deceived, that their suffering had been for nothing, that the leaders who had sent them to die had lied. But all of them remembered. The vanilla milkshake, then, became more than a drink. It became a story, a legend passed down through families and reunions, a symbol of a moment when the world turned upside down and nothing was as it seemed. It was the taste of defeat and the taste of possibility, the sweetness of surrender and the bitterness of disillusionment, all mixed together in a single glass. And in that glass there was a truth. The truth was this: that ideology, no matter how deeply held, no matter how fiercely defended, is fragile. It can be shaken by a single experience, a single taste, a single moment of doubt. The Japanese soldiers who laughed at the milkshake were not weak men. They were men who had fought and suffered and endured more than most people will ever know. But they were also men who had been taught to see the world in a certain way, and when that way no longer fit the evidence before their eyes, they had to choose, to cling to the lie or to accept the truth. Most chose the truth. And in choosing, they became part of a larger transformation, a shift that would reshape not only Japan but the entire post-war world. The milkshake was a small part of that shift, a tiny detail in a vast and complicated history. But it was a detail that mattered because it was real, because it happened, because it was felt and tasted and remembered. In the end, the story of the milkshake is not a story about America or Japan, victory or defeat, democracy or militarism. It is a story about human beings, about the ways we are shaped by what we are taught and the ways we can be changed by what we experience. It is a story about the power of the ordinary, a glass, a straw, a few ounces of ice cream and milk, to challenge the extraordinary, to quietly undermine the grand narratives we tell ourselves about who we are and what we believe. The Japanese soldiers who laughed at the milkshake did not stop being Japanese. They did not betray their culture or their heritage. But they learned something new, that there was more to the world than they had been told, that the enemy was not always evil, that abundance was not always weakness, that pleasure was not always a sin. They learned, in other words, that the world was bigger and stranger and more complicated than the stories they had been taught. And in that learning they found a kind of freedom, not the freedom of victory, but the freedom of understanding, the freedom to see clearly, to question, to doubt, to grow. This is the legacy of the milkshake. Not a weapon, not a tool, but a moment, a small, sweet, impossible moment when everything changed, when laughter broke through the darkness, when men who had been enemies became, if only for a heartbeat, something else. Something human. Today, there are no Japanese veterans left who remember the milkshakes. The last of them died years ago, taking their memories with them. But the story remains, passed down through children and grandchildren, through historians and archivists, through the quiet and persistent work of those who believe that even the smallest details of history matter. And perhaps they are right. Perhaps the milkshake, that strange and simple drink, tells us something important about the nature of war and peace, about the ways we fight and the ways we heal, about the terrible and beautiful fact that we are all, in the end, vulnerable to the truth. The truth of the milkshake was this, that the world is not what we are told it is. That the enemy is not always the monster we imagine. That suffering is not the only path to strength. That abundance is not a sin. That pleasure is not a weakness. That laughter, even in the darkest of times, is still possible. And that sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is take a sip of something cold and sweet and allow himself, for just a moment, to be surprised.